welcome you to this morning's webinar on Ireland's offshore wind energy ambition and the international supply chain. We are going to get started in a couple of moments, and I'm really looking forward to the presentations we're going to hear from later on. We're at an incredibly exciting time for our industry. We have a new target of 7 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030, and we know we have the pipeline of projects, we have the people to deliver them. And we have a government policy framework, I think, that's been moving ahead significantly in the last couple of months. Maybe we would like to be seeing it move more quickly, but I think it's definitely clear that there's a drive from government to deliver offshore wind energy that we haven't seen before. And the government's recent establishment of an offshore wind energy delivery task force, I think, is going to be critical to moving that forward. But if we're going to develop these 7 gigawatts of offshore wind farms, who's actually going to build them? With other countries also looking to increase their ambition in offshore wind energy, is there going to be enough capacity in the international supply chain to build and connect these projects in time, or is there a risk that Ireland could be left behind? To discuss that today and maybe answer a couple of those questions, we're joined by a fantastic panel this morning. We're going to start the webinar off in a moment with a presentation from Mattia, who is the Senior Advisor for Offshore Wind Energy with Wind Europe. And he's going to be taking us through an analysis they did a little bit earlier this year, looking at the availability of vessels for the development and construction of offshore wind energy in Europe. After Mattia's presentation, we're delighted to be joined by two of Europe's leading experts in the offshore supply chain from two companies who are going to be critical to Europe's and perhaps to Ireland's offshore wind energy ambition. First, we're going to hear from Norman Skillen, who is the General Manager for the UK and Ireland with Jan de Nul, and then from Malou Wagner, who is the Senior Commercial Manager with Boscalis. Before I invite Mattia to start, just a reminder to everyone that this webinar is being recorded. A copy of the webinar will be sent to everyone who registered for this morning's event. And also just a reminder to please submit your questions through the chat function at any point in the process. We want to try and get as many questions as possible. I'm going to be trying to chair the event, try to get to as many of them as we can. And I think the more questions we get from the audience, I think the better and the more engaged the conversation, the debate will be. And I think we have three real industry experts here, and I think it will be really great to hear from them and to hear them address the questions that you have. So I might ask Mattia to start sharing his screen, and I think he's got a couple of slides to take you through. And I'm just going to mute myself.
Many thanks, Justin. Many thanks to Wind Energy Ireland for the invitation, and good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to show now a short presentation just to set the scene. Let's start with Wind Europe. We are basically the former European Wind Energy Association. We have very similar activity of what Wind Energy Ireland has. We do operate at European level. That's our target / partners are the European institutions. What you can see here are our members. We do represent the big wind turbine manufacturers and wind farm developers, power utilities from one side, and the whole supply chain from the others, component manufacturers, service providers, maritime contractors, installation, financial and research institutes. And then, of course, we rely a lot on the network of national wind energy association across Europe. Wind Europe covers both onshore and offshore wind, but today we will focus indeed on offshore wind in Europe. Next slide indeed is showing where we stand today. 28 gigawatt of offshore wind installed in Europe, that's including the UK, covering more or less 3% of Europe's electricity demand. In the map, you can see the blue bars is the capacity installed in gigawatt, while the red bars are the wind share of electricity. We see UK leading with 13 gigawatt of offshore wind installed, followed by Germany with 8, the Netherlands with 3, and Belgium and Denmark with 2. We see now most of the developments happening in the North Sea. That is the sea basin with the best conditions in terms of water depth and wind resource. You might be aware that last week the head of states of the Baltic countries signed the Bornholm Declaration committing to offshore wind in the Baltic Sea basin. We're seeing already some developments in the Atlantic Sea, of course, in the Mediterranean, and maybe slightly delayed, the Black Sea. Now, this is where we stand today. Staying in Europe, what you can see now are the cumulative installations until 2030. 2030, in which we foresee to have up to 160 gigawatt of offshore wind in Europe. The bars represent, as I say, the cumulative installations. The colors are the countries. So this is an increase of more than 5 times of what we have today, the 28 gigawatt I was mentioning before. And maybe it's already worth to notice the growth of the cumulative installation, which might seem exponential or at least linear until 25, 26, and then the growth will increase quite exponentially, especially from 29 and 2030. So now this is where we stand in Europe. I'm going now to extend a bit the scope to also introduce some figures coming from the report that Justin was mentioning before. This is the worldwide trend. So maybe just focus 1 second on the bottom graph. You can see the lines are the cumulative installations. The red is for total worldwide. As you can see, the same that we just seen with Europe, which now is the gray bar line, is following the same trend from 57 gigawatt today to 316. On the top part, you can see the annual installation, so how many gigawatt we need to install every year, and that confirmed the trend we were seeing before, and the jump from 2028 onwards from 30 gigawatt per year to 45 and up to 50 gigawatt per year. So these trends actually pushed the partners that you see here. The study was led by the Polish Wind Energy Association to actually screen the current vessel availability for offshore wind installation and operation, and check whether we do have enough currently. The fleet is enough now to fulfill the current and future installations. So this is to show you the scope. Those in light blue, foundation installation vessels, wind turbine installation vessels, and cable laying vessels is where I will focus today. But before entering, I want to also to present 2 other trends which represent the growth of the industry in terms of wind turbine, so the capacity of the wind turbine installed, and the total capacity of the wind farms. So the first, the average turbine size are the purple dot, and you should refer to the left axis, the average wind turbine size. We see in the early 2000s, the average was 2 megawatt. Today, in 2021, we are installing turbines of an average size of 8 megawatt, and as you can see in the estimation, by the end of the decade, we will be over 14 megawatt. A very similar trend are the red dots with the average project size. So you should now refer to the left axis also here, few hundreds megawatt, the project capacity in the early 2000. Today, an average wind farm is already above 800 megawatt, and we expect in the extent of 1 gigawatt more in the second half of the decade. So let's start. I will give you now a quick overview, trying to not get too technical, but our assessment started with the turbine installation vessels. They have a lead time of 3 to 4 years. This means how much time do we need to build them. In our assessment, just for your information, we divided the 3 categories based on the wind turbine capacity, which of course is strictly related to the size and weight. Now this maybe it's worth to focus 1 second on the right hand graph, which shows the demand versus supply of vessels. So the bars are the demand, and the red and the green line are the supply. Now we can see when basically when the bars are above the line, there will be a shortage. So for turbine installation vessels, we see that without new addition, as from 2025, there will be shortages, which will be even stronger between 2029 and 2030, where we might miss up to 15 gigawatt per year. This means it's missing 12 installation vessels worldwide to actually sustain the current growth trend of growth. Similarly, for the foundation installation vessels, a similar lead time here, also here divided by weight directly. Let's watch again the same graph, this time for foundation installation vessels. We do see that already in 2024 and 2025, we will have the shortages will be much stronger from the end of the decade, 2028, 2029, and 2030, with a gap of 9 foundation installation vessels, which might miss 12 gigawatt per year of installations. And finally, the cable laying vessels. These have a lead time of 2 to 3 years, and these are used for, of course, install export cables and interconnectors, but also interarray and joint cables. Let's look at the graph for the cable laying vessels. We actually see that the market maybe is keeping up a bit better until the half of the decade. But again, here from 2028 onwards, we might miss up to 17 gigawatt of capacity, which will mean a gap of 22 vessels. I know there were a lot of numbers, so I included these slides to do a recap. And when we want to look at the shortages, then we should focus as the last point of each bubble, 22 cable laying vessels shortages, 9 foundation installation vessel shortage, and a shortage of 12 wind turbine installation vessels. And I'm going to close it here just maybe with some elements of discussion. There are some recommendations that might be picked up later. I guess, how can we solve these shortages? Well, we must increase the willingness to invest. And now we've seen vessels, but as we will see, I'm sure in the panel later, it's not only related to vessels, it's related to the whole supply chain, ports, other components, and anything related. We must have clear outlooks through tendering specification. The supply chain needs to know what will happen where. And the best way to know is for its government actually providing clear tender timeline and specifications, because the investments in the supply chain must be made well in advance to be ready once the installation will start. And this is of utmost importance, but not only we need to know what will happen when, we need more. We need more projects. We need to streamline governmental permitting process in order to be able to deliver more and deliver faster. And of course, the European institution, but also member states must provide the good regulatory and investment environment for building new vessels, for upgrading the ports and the whole supply chain. And finally, maybe one last mention on the local content. Of course, as we in Europe, we do believe that's a very important tool to actually maintain the European leadership, technological leadership that we have today, and keep the industrial base for offshore wind in Europe. All local context in the tender specification should be at European level. But I'm sure we will go back to the discussion later. So for now, I will close it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mattia. I'm not sure I've seen many presentations before that simultaneously had me incredibly excited about the potential out there and then slightly terrified about whether we were actually going to be able to tap into that potential and to deliver the projects in Europe and globally. I might bring in our next speaker now, who's Norman Skillen from Jan de Nul, and I think Norman has a couple of slides to share as well, Norman. So if you want to see if you can share your screen there. That's coming through right there now, Norm.
Good. Oh, good morning. Okay, I'll keep it in this mode because if I put it into full screen, it might actually drop out. So, okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Norman Skillen from Jan de Nul. You might detect from my accent, I'm originally from County Down at the foot of the Mourne Mountains. And for the last sort of 8+ years, I've been in offshore wind, and the last 5 of those with Jan de Nul as the general manager for the UK and Ireland. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to Jan de Nul. And then I'll talk a little bit about the type of company we are and the vessels that we use, just to give you a little bit more insight. Mattia has given a very good background there in terms of where the industry is. And I'll help put just a little bit more on the sort of challenges, because you might say, well, why don't we just build more vessels? But there are, first of all, that's an expensive thing to do, but there are other challenges as well to doing that. So let's see if we can go through. Okay, so appreciate that Jan de Nul may be new to many of you, quite a few of you probably know us already, but we are the Belgian marine contractor. A lot of the international marine contractors have a Dutch shareholding in them somewhere, but we're the one that's purely Belgian, and it's owned by the de Nul family in Belgium. And maybe it's worth saying that there's probably about half a dozen companies worldwide that can build a complete offshore wind farm, and then you've probably got about another 10 or so that can do parts of it, whether that's installing a cable or installing foundations, something along this. So that's the sort of current industry for offshore wind construction, or about that sort of size. And you do get an effect from the oil and gas industry as well, which may actually come back a bit in the next year or two with energy security issues. So it puts additional stress on the main supply chain. But back to Jan de Nul, let's say we're a tier 1 marine contractor. So that means that we can take on a contract to potentially build a whole offshore wind farm, or certainly take on a large part of the construction and manage that, and manage the subcontractors that would go with it as well. You can see we operate internationally. There are 208 projects in 2021, so we operate all around the world. Turnover has been relatively flat over the years, so as different parts of the business move about, it stays at about 2 billion, and that's our principal business. The safety is very important, so the safe execution of complex and multidisciplinary marine projects. So, and that's just how we're organized as the offshore business within Jan de Nul. So I'll not go through all of this, but these are some of the things that you have to do when you construct an offshore wind farm. So depending on whether you're building large chunks of it, or whether you're just installing a cable, or whether you're adding things. We have a rock team there on the right. So you use a lot of rock to protect cables and foundations from wearing away over their 25+ year life. So there's many. In a typical offshore wind project, you could have about 3,000 contracts. So a lot of what you see on this screen here, seabed preparation. New challenges we're seeing are things like drilling. So a lot of the easy seabeds in Europe have been utilized already. So we're getting onto the more complex areas now. And with this complexity, it adds cost to the construction as well. So as a company, just to give you a flavor of the type of companies, type of projects we're involved with. So we're preparing for one in the Baltic Sea next year, and that's 2 Ørsted projects, Gode Wind and Borkum Riffgrund 3, where we will install the foundations and the secondary steel in those, and also the offshore substation foundation and top side. So, and that's going to be on a new vessel called Les Elysees, which I'll come to in a minute. We're also preparing to do the inter-array cabling in Vineyard 1 in the US. So this is the first large project in the US. So we're having to find our way with the American supply chain and working with all the different federal bodies and the complexity that you've got there. And it is a complex market, the US market. And then we're also preparing for Dogger Bank next year, which is in the middle of the North Sea. And this will be the largest project in the world when it's built. And we will be installing the turbines on that from April 2023 to April 2026. So just to give an example, that's a big project. It's using the largest turbines that were available at the time the contract was signed. So it'll start with 13 megawatt turbines and finish with 14 megawatt turbines. The contract was signed in 2021 for something that goes on for 5 years from signing of the contract. So it gives you an idea of duration. So if you wanted to build something in Ireland to use a vessel like this, you could be looking at waiting 6, 7, 8 or more years potentially today, just with where the industry is and the vessels that are available. So because we're in Ireland, I have to mention the Greenlink Interconnector because it is part of the energy transition here. So this is a delayed project, but it's coming to life next year. So if you're anywhere near Wexford next spring, you might see the connector there on the left, which is the cable laying vessel that we'll use to connect County Wexford over to Pembroke in Wales. And again, this is the sort of typical type of cable lay vessel you'd use for doing something like this, where there's nearly 200 kilometers of cable involved. And it'll lay a cable to a depth, in this case, of about 125 meters as it crosses the Irish Sea. 2 cables and 1 fiber optic will be, where the fiber optic will be bundled with one of the cables. So that's the cable lay vessel. This is the Voltaire, which will start in Dogger Bank next year. So this will be the tallest jack-up in the world, and we will get it in Europe ready for action probably around the end of the year. But you can see it's got a football pitch-sized deck. The top of the crane, the jib there, is 1 meter taller than the Eiffel Tower. And the question for the industry is something like this big enough? Because we ordered this in 2019. We're just about to get it, and we're already seeing scenarios that might challenge it. So there's a nervousness about going and building more of this type of equipment because the turbine sizes are keeping increasing and increasing. And you build a vessel like this, you want 15 plus years worth of construction work out of it. I don't think today that this will be able to install the turbines in 15 years' time, given the projections that we're seeing. But so that's another reason why the supply chain can only react in a certain way. A couple of pictures of that vessel being built in China. This is the other floating installation vessel, which Malou may show you a picture of something similar. The number of the marine contractors have got these floating installation vessels. This is Les Elysees here, and there you go. So both the Voltaire and Les Elysees, they're ultra low emission vessels. And if we come to talk about carbon footprint, we can discuss that a bit. But again, will it be big enough? Ordered in 2019, we get it at the end of this year. And already we can see that maybe in a small number of years, it's going to be stretched. So huge investments, but can they keep pace with the industry? So I think I'll probably finish at that point. Happy to take questions with the panel, but it's just to give you an insight into the type of work a marine contractor does, particularly with offshore wind, and the sort of equipment that we're using. There's a lot of other smaller equipment that goes with these bigger vessels, but really for your project, you're going to have to secure something along these lines, or you're not going to be able to do the main construction. Okay, so Justin, I'll pass it back to you in the panel.
Thanks very much for that, Norman. That was fascinating. And I just, the images of some of those vessels and the size of them is absolutely incredible. And I think the fact that we're already asking ourselves whether they're actually going to be big enough for the turbines that are going to be needed in the years to come, I think is an indication of how fast the technology is changing, but also goes back to that point that Mattia touched on as well, the need for certainty for the supply chain, not just from government, but from turbine manufacturers and from developers, so there's more clarity as early as possible. I'm going to turn to our last speaker and ask Malou Wagner to join us. There's questions coming in through the chat function. Please do keep them coming in for either Norman, Malou, or for Mattia. And once Malou's taken us through her slides, we'll open it up to the floor. Thanks very much, Malou.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. In the meantime, I hope my slides are also loading. Indeed, in the background, I have one of the pictures of the vessels that Norman was referring to, which is our Boskalis 2 vessel, which is just delivered earlier this year and currently working in Taiwan on the Changfang and Jidao project. Yes. Yeah. So thanks for the opportunity to speak here. As a brief introduction, yeah, my name is Malou Wagner. I'm a commercial manager with Boscalis, specifically focused on our heavy lifting business units. So where we look at mainly at the foundation installation vessels, and then focusing on our UK and Ireland projects. I also understand that probably not everyone is familiar with Boskalis, so I just give a brief introduction. Boskalis is, also just like Jan and Nul, a global marine contractor. We're based out of the Netherlands. The revenue in 2021 was almost 3 billion. It's a company that's basically half dredging, half active in offshore energy, and in offshore energy both in oil and gas and in renewables. We are also already established in Ireland since 76 through our dredging entity. And in the UK, we have been growing quite a lot over the last decades through mainly acquisition. For instance, VBMS, cable laying company, also Guardline, geotechnical and geophysical survey is 100% Boskalis, but also acquisitions in oil and gas like Reaver Subsea in Aberdeen. So that's just to give you a bit of a view. I also added a link in the slide for any further reference also to the projects. But so what does Boskalis do in offshore wind? Well, quite a lot. So I think we can basically deliver your whole wind farm project, anything from the UXO detection and removal to the survey site on the early DevEx to all the construction phase for foundation installation and transportation, the scour protection. We have the rock dumping vessels. We have the cable installation vessels with all the also trenchers and tools that we develop in-house. And then we also have a lot of tugs, barges, and subsea services. We have experience with decommissioning, so getting more relevant in the offshore wind plants. We have a lot of transport assets as well, like heavy transport vessels, like you see in the background, but also then the barges for shorter distances. So yeah, the only thing we do not focus on is the turbine installation, just mentioned also in the presentation, but we do focus a lot on the cable lay and the foundation side. Yeah, the projects we're currently active in are quite global. So on cable laying, we're mainly active currently in Europe. On foundation installation, currently both are Boscalis 1, which is a 3,000-ton crane, and the Boscalis 2, which is the 4,000-ton crane, are both in Taiwan. There's also a big backlog in the US for the coming years. Yeah, truly everywhere where offshore wind will bring us. I think this is what I wanted to say on the Boskalis introduction, not too much more in detail on the type of vessels. I like to share internal slide we made, which is very similar to, I think, what Mattia just presented us. This is a bit of our assessment on the shortage in the foundation installation vessels specifically. Yeah, as said before, also, yeah, there is definitely a shortage coming. Also in the Wind Europe report, it's mentioned that can be bridged by new vessels, but yeah, there's a lot of challenges with new vessels. This is not a minor investment for even not for a company like Boskalis. And as also Norman was indicating, we have to understand what we're designing the vessel for, as we have quite a long time that earn back period for these vessels, and they preferably have a lifetime of 25 years. And it's really hard to understand where the industry is going and to basically justify the significant investments required, especially looking at the foundation and turbine installation vessels. And then there's another topic is of course the lead time, which is also very restricted by the supply chain for building these assets. I would say the most restricted currently are the cranes, which have at least a 3-year delivery timeline, so which you have to take into account. So it's yeah, it's also not an easy road to get these new vessels online and get these business cases conclusive. And actually on our end, just looking from a contractor perspective, also as Norman was saying, we all just built new vessels. And before they were even delivered, we were already discussing with our boards to build more vessels. And that's also a bit hard case to make. So I would say, so what do we see nowadays in the market? Well, it's definitely turned into a supplier's market for the contractors. And what we see is that the contracting timelines shift forward. I think roughly now, for instance, looking at 26 monopile installation projects, I think already 20% is maybe already awarded. So that's a bit the timelines we're looking at currently. And it's also to involve contractors early is also a challenge on the project side because there's still a lot of uncertainties and often also not a lot of budget in the DevEx phase to make commitments. And also on the contractor side, yeah, we like to try to find the right projects that are, well, the right match for the assets, and the right risk profile, right? So I think that's also different jurisdictions, different conditions, different clients, different financial risks, different supply chain risks. So that is basically, I think, from a contractor side, how we look at all these projects and try to focus on the ones that that will make most sense to us. Because also there we are very much restrained, like the whole market, like the supply chain, like the developers, in our resources. So it's also impossible to help everyone or tender all the projects that are out there. So the result is, I think, for all the contractors, they have to be a bit more selective how where they put their efforts. Because we also need all our people to get all these new assets sailing and the new projects going, and it's quite a challenge. And on the other side, we're really looking for partners to develop these new assets to solve this shortage. And there we really need the input from the market, and preferably we also need to have a partner or the backing to see that we can make this work in a certain portfolio for a certain asset. So a lot of challenges, very exciting market too. So I think that's where I would leave my my notes for now. And this is the contact details of both my colleague Stuart, who's more focusing on the cables, and myself. So thanks, Justin. Hand it back over to you.
Thanks very much, Malou. And I might ask all of our speakers and presenters if they want to put their cameras on and maybe unmute as well. We have a pile of questions coming through, so I think these were absolutely fantastic presentations, and I certainly learned a lot, and I think they've prompted a good bit of debate already in the chat function. I've a lot of my own questions, but we might start off with one of the questions maybe that's been flagged up in chat, and I suppose it touches maybe on the point that you made initially when you were going through your presentation, Mattia, that China wasn't included in the research. And one of the couple of the points that we made in the chat function is almost, can China save us? You know, can we get vessels from China that could come to Europe and could do this work? Or could we build these vessels in China? And Norman, I don't know if you want to come in on this, but I think one of the images you were showing a vessel that was being built in China. I suppose the question then is that where the construction of Boskalis and Yangtze vessels is going to be happening in the years to come? Is that where we're going to get the ships actually built? Or are we going to continue to try and build them in Europe? So Mattia, maybe do you want to maybe take that first, just to talk a little bit about the role of China and how you look to China in the research? And then I think it'd be interesting to hear from Malou and Norman what role they see China as either a source of vessels or a source of construction of vessels in trying to deal with that gap between what we want to build and needing the vessels to actually get there.
Yeah, absolutely, Justin. I also wrote in the chat, I think also you clarified in the report, we do the distinction of vessels manufactured in China and purchased by European companies operating here, and vessels made in China by Chinese company and used for their own market. We do for a quite important growth for the Chinese market too. So Chinese vessels owners coming to Europe with their fleet are excluded from the airport. But still, we see, as we have seen that the other presentation, some European manufacturers are manufacturing there. So maybe here I leave it to Norman or Malou.
Well, maybe just to say, I mean, I think China lags behind the European market, for example, with vessels and that, but it's catching up. So and recently they were buying anything they could for use in China. So we'll just have to see how that market develops. China is probably still one of the most cost-effective places to build a vessel. So even the difference between somewhere like China and Korea is significant. So I think a number of the marine contractors will still continue to get equipment from China, because all these things, they have to fit in the overall project and sort of landscape in terms of cost. And as the vessels get bigger, the number of yards that can build them around the world starts to decrease as well. So I think you're still looking at that, especially if we go for some extra large vessels, which we're probably going to have to do before too long. So I think you're still looking at China playing a leading part in vessels for the future for offshore wind. Malou, I don't know if you feel like that.
Yeah, I think so too. It's just as you said, mainly based on the cost delta with the other countries. But it's also there's also some geopolitical issues there. So if we want to keep on working, an example in Taiwan in the future, you're not allowed to work there with Chinese-built vessels. So that's also a consideration why, an example, our Boskalis 2 was converted in dry dock world in Dubai, not in China. So a lot more factors at play there, I would say.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, I mean, the US is a sort of closed market. You have the Jones Act and various other pieces of legislation. So there is a vessel, or wind turbine installation vessel being built in the US at the moment. Maybe more will get built there, but it's an expensive place to build. So if you build one, it's probably the only country you'd use it in. So there's restrictions. So that's not that interesting for the wider marine community. So maybe something will change there one day, but we're not expecting that to happen soon. But in the meantime, the US will continue to use European vessels, particularly in their early projects. So that's going to hamper this second half of this decade, because that's when the US starts up.
Thanks, Norman. If I can take it from the world of Chinese geopolitics down to a very narrow, almost parochial focus and looking at Ireland. And it was something that really struck me in one of your comments, Norman, that you were talking about developers needing to be thinking 6, 7, and 8 years ahead. And maybe not to put either one of you on the spot, but if we're looking to be developing 7 gigawatts of offshore wind farms in Irish waters by the end of 2030, and if we're looking to get Yandano to work on that for us, or we're looking to get Boskalis to be working on that, when do we need to be knocking on your door and saying, we have a project and we're looking for you guys to be the people to do it? How soon do you need that to be happening if those 2030 targets are to be achievable?
Malou, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I'll go first on that one. I think, well, first of all, I think most relevant projects in Ireland have already been knocking on our doors, also speaking for Norman. So I'm pretty sure that's all in order. So I think, we're currently talking about for sure, like a 4-year timeline roughly. But in these initial discussions already starting maybe 5-6 years, and then narrowing down to a tender process that might be already 4 years before the offshore execution of that specific scope. 3 to 4 years, depending on the cable laying or a combination of foundation or turbines. And then I think that's roughly the timelines we're looking at, and that's also, I think, partly what makes everyone busy also on the developer and the contractor side, because it's getting more, the shortage is getting more extreme. So basically within the last year, we have been maybe discussing the years 25, 26, and 27 already together. So that's a bit of a challenge for everyone, I think, to see how to deal with that. Norman?
Yeah, and it's not just vessels, it's the other components as well. If you wanted foundations from Europe at the moment, you probably wouldn't get them before 2026. That's if you were placing your order today. Now, you might be able to go to other parts of the world and even change your foundation type. But so that I was on a call recently with National Grid in the UK, and one of the main cable manufacturers in Europe was saying they're now fully booked up to 2029. So yes, they could build another plant. But again, if you wanted to place an order with them, you'd be struggling. And I think the other thing we are seeing with some of the larger developers, they're almost looking to bypass the tender process. You know, they know that they have a wind farm or a series of wind farms. They know roughly what they want to pay. If you have capacity as a marine contractor, they can move things quite quickly. But to be able to do that, you need certainty in a market. And the idea of, say, a 2-year tender cycle to choose a vessel or whatever, I think this is going to change very, very quickly. But coming back to your original question, I think really, if you're not able to place your orders in 2023, I think you'll be struggling to get the projects built by 2030. And that's, you can see the heat. Mattia's showing you the graphs. I think things are probably accelerating even faster than those graphs show. And it is going to be difficult in the second half of the year. And it's hard for the marine contractor sometimes to now choose what to do. You know, Malou will remember 4 or 5 years ago, a new project would come in once a month and everyone would get behind it and everyone would bid it. Whereas now that the marine industry hasn't got the capacity to do that. So, you know, when you have a project and you have to bring it to marine contractors and stuff, they will just be flat out. So it's hard to almost to get their attention initially. And it's just a fact of life. So this is the sort of challenge you're going to up a bit. But I would say the sooner you can do it, the more chance you have of something happening.
Thanks, thanks both. We might go to yourself, Mattia, just for a moment, because I think listening to Malou and Norman, I think one of the benefits, obviously, would be if we could do more within Europe, if we could have more vessels, have more manufacturing capacity available in Europe. And I know this is something that you guys are working on quite vigorously. At a European level, what needs to change to enable us to supply more of the raw materials, more of the vessels, more of the services that are required? And I was really interested by a point Norman made a little bit earlier on as well, that in some ways we might be looking at Chinese ports simply because the projects will get so big that the number of ports available to actually build these kinds of vessels will shrink. So could you talk a little bit about Wind Europe's priorities in this area and what you would like to see happening?
Yes, many thanks, Justin. Indeed, as I mentioned before, offshore wind, we still have the technological leadership here in Europe. 3 wind turbines manufacturers are European. But as you might have seen from some Wind Europe press release, at least in the first quarter of 2022, they were all operating at a loss. Now, the supply chain is struggling, I mean, for the geopolitical context, inflation, and all those aspects, but also for what I was mentioning before, there are not enough projects and there is not enough visibility. The fact of not having enough projects is also showing us that we are kind of seeing a race to the bottom. Now, most of the tenders are still price-based and companies want to be at sea installing and operating wind turbines. And this brought level to go down a lot, cost to go down a lot, but of course this is also putting pressure on the supply chain. Now at European level we have different ways to support the growth and the health of the supply chain. There are some innovation fund, there is the European investment banks providing loans at an advantageous rate. There is, of course, the recovery fund. Now member states will be asked to allocate all those pot of money, and there will be multiple opportunities here. We have been advocating a lot for this money, for example, to be invested in ports. You mentioned those. The lead times there might be even longer than those lead times that we've been discussing until now for building new vessels, and the investment must be made even before. So the recommendations also here are similar to those that we have seen before. We need faster permitting. We say for offshore wind, we need one-stop shops, which is the case in most countries now, but work still must be done. Areas we mentioned before, Norman was mentioning that maybe companies will try to bypass auctions from countries, and indeed we might see that certain countries might opt for what we call the open door approach. Some countries will opt for a combination of both, for tendering pre-developed and non-pre-developed sites as a means to speed up deployment. But indeed, we need more projects, more certainties. Governments are there. I mentioned before the maritime special planning. That's the first demand side policies that gives an indication of how much areas are allocated in each country for offshore wind, but member states should do one step beyond. It's not enough to secure the space at sea. We need to know the when and how that I was mentioning before. So the tender timelines, member states are now revising their NECPs, the National Energy and Climate Plan. So the first step will be indeed embedding all these volumes into binding targets.
Thanks very much, Mattia. I think that's something you've just added to our to-do list in the policy and public affairs team here in Wind Energy Ireland. I'm conscious of time. I think we might go a little bit past 12 o'clock just to maybe deal with some of the questions going through, but I might try and go through some of the questions in the chat now and throw them out to the panel. So I'm just taking one from Nick. Can a comment be made about Irish offshore wind site water depths? He's making the point that not all of the vessels we are talking about are suitable for Irish waters. So, I mean, obviously, initially, the phase 1 projects we're going to be looking at are all fixed bottom projects, I suppose in the 50, 60 meters and under. And then floating wind energy projects will hopefully start to be something we're looking at towards the end of the decade, along with many more fixed bottom projects. But I'm not sure if there's more detail on the question, Nick, but maybe Norman or Malou, the vessels you guys are talking about, are they suitable for all kinds of water depths, or are there certain kinds of water depths where they wouldn't really be the right option?
Shall I?
Yeah, ask Malou
please,
first,
Malou.
and maybe Norman.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think that's also interesting, also from the graphs from Mattia, right? So not all these vessels have the same capabilities, especially if we look at foundations, because for turbine installation, at least all they have the same concept. They're all jack-up vessels, right? If you look at foundations, they're either jack-up vessels or floating vessels. So either like what you see with Norman or what you see in my background. And normally the jack-ups are more capable of shallower water than the floating vessels are more for deeper water, as they operate on DP and they need some more water depth. But actually that in the end only, I would say, narrows the option. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Norman, because if you have shallow water, you cannot basically even tap in that whole pool of assets, but you have to tap into a certain pool of assets that is a bit more suitable for shallow water.
So it's a more limited pool that you'd be looking to try and get your vessels from.
Yeah, but so does every project, I would say, or every country has its challenges. So also not all Irish projects are shallow, but most of them are rather shallow. Then also some of them have sandy soils, but a lot of them also have quite challenging soils. Also looking at putting in fixed foundations, so that might result in drilling requirements, which also is kind of a separate requirement again to either your vessels or your tools, but also to your construction timeline. So I think there's quite a few niches in there that define what assets would be suitable. That actually, I would say, doesn't make your choice any bigger, to be honest.
Yeah. Norman, would you agree? Would you go along with that?
Yes, no, I think pretty much can agree with all of that. I mean, there first of all there's the floating and fixed offshore wind. So I think for Ireland to hit its 7 gigawatt target, the majority of this will come from fixed, I think. And the sort of vessels we're talking about can certainly do that today. Your limits on if every project goes for the largest turbines that are available, then you're just working with a small handful of jack-up vessels, because as Malou said, all turbines, it's the same concept. They're all designed to be installed from a fixed table. So So that there definitely would be a bottleneck there, and you'd be competing in the global market. And there's no reason why you shouldn't be successful, but it will be a big competition. With foundations, you can sometimes get help from former oil and gas vessels, and so it's a slightly bigger pool to work from. But there's pressure on everything. So I think in terms of the phase 1 projects, the equipment is all around that can work with those today. I mean, 1 or 2 have quite shallow locations, so you may have a narrower range of smaller vessels to use there that can handle the bigger components. But some are on rock, so they undoubtedly will need drilling. So you might have to add in an extra year to have a drilling program before you actually start putting your foundations in, depending on the size of the offshore wind farm.
We might turn to. Oh, sorry, Mattia, go on.
Yeah. May I add just one element here, because there is another important difference to keep in mind when we talk about bottom fixed and floating, which the assembly. Floating wind turbines and foundation are assembled in the ports, and then they are towed to the wind farm location. Mm-hmm. So this actually brings back the requirements to the ports, because then floating will need much bigger cranes in the port area and much more space, because then you need to store both turbines, towers, and floating foundation, assemble them, and then tow them to the wind farm site. So also ports here should not be forgotten when we talk about floating wind, especially about space. Space is a big problem for ports.
You've literally stolen the next question I had on my list from Mattia, which was about port infrastructure. And I think it might bring Norman and Malou in on this as well. So, I mean, as you both will be aware, we've one fantastic port available for the construction of offshore wind farms at Belfast, but no other port in Ireland would currently be at a stage where it would be able to support the construction of either fixed bottom or floating wind farms. So how big an issue is that for you guys when you're looking at Ireland as a place to invest and you're looking at port capacity? How heavily does that weigh in your thoughts? Maybe Norman to take that one first.
Yeah, I mean, port, yes, Mattia is right. Port is a very significant part of the project, and quite often it gets forgotten about, and then it comes in more towards the end, and it goes right back to the top of the list of priorities. So it is helpful to have a marshalling port or a construction port if you can get one near to site. And I think for floating offshore wind, you might be looking at having to use about 3 ports if it's a big project. So not just the one, but if you think about fixed, yes, otherwise you're just adding to transport costs, and you're putting more stress on some of the components if you're bringing them from further away.
Would you agree? Is it something that when Boscalis is looking at Ireland, is ports a factor in terms of your consideration?
Yeah, it's for sure a factor, but in the end, it's something I would say indeed you have to solve as a project anyway. I would say irrespective of what contractor you work with. So it's just we definitely look at that, and we also talk a lot with other ports for the development and give them inputs on either fixed or floating. What would we require towards the future? But yeah, I think it's a challenge that you then have to tackle together on the project, and it might not work flawlessly yet for the first round of projects. Yep. I think everybody is aware of that as well. So.
I might take the next question from Vanessa with Inish Offshore Wind, who's also the vice chair of our supply chain working group. And this is really for all speakers as I suppose people with a broad European perspective on the European market for offshore wind. How attractive is Ireland compared to other markets in the European Union, other markets globally? And what would you like to see if there was one thing, 2 things you would like to see change in Irish policy over the next short period of time to make us a more attractive location for wind farm development for suppliers like yourselves? What would you like to see? So maybe I might take Malou first, and then Norman, and then Mattia.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I think this is a question I've seen more not only in the session of today, and I think it's really difficult to answer. Like, I think there's a lot already happened in Ireland. A lot more clarity is already provided on the regulatory framework than it was previously. But I think there we basically come back to Mattia's initial point. I think on his conclusions is that we require the clarity and the certainty, so also the developers have at least the certainty that they can go ahead at one point in time on a certain program. And I think that's very much a challenge if you're working on a first round of offshore wind projects where there's so many challenges ahead with with the regulations and basically the consent approvals and so I think that's the most important part, is because as long as the developers have clarity, then they can provide it to the supply chain as well, right? So that's, I would say, for us the most important.
Okay, Norman, clarity.
Yeah, it's clarity and it's certainty, actually. Because we were in a position where we had to decide between two projects, both happening at the same time, and we made the wrong decision because the one we chose then got a 2-year delay. So we had to let the other one go. And this will be, so marine contractors will have to make a decision potentially between a project somewhere else in Europe or the world and an Irish project. So, is the project likely to face an environmental challenge that could hold it back? We see this. Are there issues with the grid connection or whatever? Has it got a contract to take the electricity? So we have it, as Malou would say, there's a balance of risk here. So, and if there's certainty that the project's going ahead, then the marine contractors will certainly bid for it and execute it if awarded a contract. But if there's anything unusual about the timing and it's hard to tie it down, then there are other projects which have certainty, and it is a sort of first come first served market. So Ireland will lose out. So I think getting that certainty and clarity then helps everybody move forward.
Great. Thanks, Norman. Mattia, I might bring yourself in, and maybe if you've thoughts particularly on, I suppose, the degree of certainty available in other European markets. What certainty are they able to provide that would be useful to see coming from Ireland?
Yeah, well, when we look at the different countries in Europe, I guess the first thing is the political willingness. So how is the debate at political level, including clear targets? Now, Ireland is there, so you already tick the first box, I would say. The second, also that I think we discussed it already, of course, is providing favorable conditions for investing and for the market to establish. Because we must keep in mind that what we have seen before, we have the established markets, that UK, Germany, the Netherlands, that they have already a supply chain, logistic and operation in place, but then are also those that are entering in the markets now. So it's not enough just political ambitions and words. We must have on paper favorable conditions for the supply chain to invest. We always say investments in the supply chain are a combination of public and private funding, so everybody has to do its own. Of course, also the tender specifications will be very important. Here, I guess we can learn by doing. We do have established tender models and financing mechanisms, such as the contract for difference, that can really help to lower the cost, the financing cost of offshore wind, as kind of relieve the supply chain itself. And then, yeah, as mentioned by Norman and Malou before, clarity and certainty of the specific projects.
Thanks, Mattia. I might bring in another question here from Carl, which is kind of looking at supply chain from a different perspective, and the domestic perspective, really. And maybe yourself first, Norman, and then Malou. When Jan de Nul or Boskalis are developing on these projects, what kind of opportunities do you see for an Irish supply chain? Like, do you use Irish contractors? Is that something that you would be considering or looking at? And what opportunities would you see there maybe for Irish businesses that are maybe not in offshore wind yet, but are looking at it as a space that they might want to develop into? Sorry, Norman, you're on mute. I knew it was going to be one of us. I thought it was going to be me because it was me on the practice session yesterday. So I'm glad it was somebody else this time.
So apologies, everyone. Yes. So I mean, Jan de Nul have used some Irish companies internationally. So there are some companies already active in the supply chain. But I think as you get closer to construction, there are opportunities certainly for all the smaller vessels that get provided, guard vessels, crew transfer vessels, this sort of thing. And there are companies operating in Irish waters. And I think if you take a look to what some of the smaller companies do across the water in the UK, some of the Irish companies could do that. So there's everything from, you know, vessel supplies. There's usually workshops and space needed onshore. If you have a port, there's a whole range of services that come with a port. Maybe some of the secondary steel, coating of it or whatever, preparation of it could be done in Ireland. So it needs a bit more analysis, because an offshore wind farm breaks down into a whole lot of nuts and bolts. And if they can be supplied competitively, it's not just into Irish projects. They could supply them into the UK projects or projects anywhere in the world. So it's quite a strategic decision for a company to invest and get engaged in offshore wind, but they are coming into a global market. So rather than just one project. And the good news is now, a decade ago and even 5 years ago, when companies were getting involved in offshore wind, it was one project at a time with gaps in between. But now there's so many projects, it's a pretty continuous demand. So it's a better time almost to come in. Malou, I don't know if that chimes with you.
I can only echo Norman. Yeah, like we also have a few Irish companies already in a supply chain, and yeah, I think what you said, it's a true global market. So I think the supply chain shouldn't wait to step into offshore wind, right? And I think they don't, because there's still a lot of Irish companies already globally active and active in the UK. So I think that's important, and then they're also ready for when construction kicks off in Ireland.
Thanks, Malou. I might take this opportunity to plug our Offshore Wind Energy Conference happening in UCD on the 21st and 22nd of September. So a lot of our supply chain companies and developer companies up there. So there'll be a lot of opportunities maybe for people to meet. We're just past 12 o'clock, and there's one question I want to kind of go back to, because it was a point we've been talking about timelines and when we would need to be moving forward in Ireland to be ready for 2030. And there's a point there from Dave Walker at GE, who's, I suppose, making the logical point that if we're not going to have an ORES auction until next year, and we're not going to have planning permission for those phase one projects until perhaps 2024, 2025. What challenges does that create for this? Because if you're a developer, you can hardly go talking to Boscalis and say, I don't have planning permission and I don't have an auction contract, but I'd like you to book you in for a certain year. We're missing that certainty and clarity that's there. Is that a challenge that you're hearing from Irish developers in your engagements, that they just don't know when they're going to get planning permission? They may get the auction contracts next year, but the planning permission may take longer to get, and therefore they're not able to give you the certainty that you would like if you're looking at the Irish market. I might take Malou first on that, and then maybe Norman.
Yeah, I think that is exactly the situation we are in now, right? So I think that's a challenge, and I think the main challenge lies with developers that either have to be very certain of something which they don't have planning permission for, or have to change the timelines basically. So that's I think I have not really much more to add, but that is a current challenge, I would say.
Norman?
Yes, I mean, most of them are ploughing ahead on a timeline, and everyone can work to that. But if it comes to placing a contract and they haven't got the certainty, then the contract probably won't happen. I mean, that's the reality, because there'll be other work that the vessel can do at that period in time or whenever it's doing that. So, but if they get certainty, then we'll happily sign contracts and do the work. So I think it comes back to the certainty thing again. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate. I think we see that also every day within Boscalis, that we would really like to move forward, but indeed, if there's other projects that have the certainty of the execution timeline, we hope to have we like to have guaranteed work in certain years and not potential work in certain years. So that's unfortunately then the choice we have to make.
Okay. Well, listen, I'd like to thank Malou, Norman, and Mattia for joining us this morning. As I said earlier on, the webinar has been recorded, so we'll be sending a copy out to everybody, and we'll also, with the permission of the three panelists, also be sharing the presentations from this morning and the link to the research that Mattia and the team at Wind Europe and the wider authors put together. I just want to say thank you very much. It was a really, really educational and really, really insightful set of presentations and set of comments. I think the consensus, what was coming out very clearly, there's enormous potential in Ireland. We have, going back to Mattia's point, we have an absolute political determination in this country to deliver offshore wind, and we have a wind energy industry that's absolutely determined to do it. But if we don't have the certainty and the clarity, there is that risk that we could be coming a little bit too late to the process and we might lose out as a result of that. And those graphs that Malou and Mattia in particular presented a little bit earlier at the beginning of the presentation, showing that shortage of vessels, I think on a broader European scale, I think that's an issue that needs to be discussed. How do we get more vessels to be available to deliver the offshore wind energy we need in Europe? And I think that's something that's going to be a live issue for the months and years to come. So just to say thank you very, very much again for taking the time to join us today. And thank you all for joining us as an audience. We'll send out the material in the next day or so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Yes, no, thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.